Hello and welcome to the NBA Trades Podcast. I'm your host, Raphael. Today, I had a special guest on the podcast. It's former NBA executive Bob Whitsitt. Bob was the general manager and president of basketball operations for the Seattle Supersonics from 1986 to 1994. He was involved in all of the big trades, from acquiring Detlef Schrempf for Derrick McKey with Indiana, trading for Sam Perkins from the Lakers, and also drafting Shawn, Kemp, and Gary Payton, as well as some previous trades where he drafted Nate McMillan, traded Xavier McDaniel to the Phoenix Suns for Eddie Johnson, and acquired Ricky Pierce from the Milwaukee Bucks for Dale Ellis. So we talked about a lot of that stuff and everything that happened, especially from the beginning of his career when he started off with the Indiana Pacers as an unpaid intern, and how he got to his role as the Supersonics general manager and president. So I hope you enjoy. So I have Bob Whitsitt here with me. So Bob, how'd you get your start in sports? When you were growing up, did you want to, go to college and major in sport management or marketing or anything? What were you interested in doing when you were growing up?
Well, when I was growing up, I was just one of those kids who just really loved to play sports. In high school, I played football, basketball, and baseball. And then I went to a small college in Wisconsin, Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and I played football, basketball, and baseball up there. And I've always had a love for sports. And when I was in college, probably around my junior year, like all college kids, you're trying to figure out what you wanted to do. I was in the athletic director's office one day, and I picked up a brochure, and I read about a sports administration university where you could get a master's degree and pretty much learn how to be an athletic director for college. So that kind of sparked something on my career thoughts, and did a little research. And over the next year or so, I learned of a program that was just starting at Ohio State. And I applied at both programs. I didn't get into either one right away, but the second time applying, I got into both of them, and I chose Ohio State. And really, for me, I wanted to go into professional sports, which was not a really big business in the late 70s, but I really thought it would eventually grow into a bigger business. And I was fortunate enough, after knocking on a lot of doors and calling a lot of people, I got turned down by every NFL team, pretty much every baseball team, lots of arenas and stadiums, and most basketball teams. But eventually, I got an internship with the Indiana Pacers in 1978, and that's really what, my thought was, if I could ever get my foot in the door, I love this opportunity so much, it's up to me to do a great job and make sure that I never get shown the door.
So you became an intern for the Pacers in 1978. So the Pacers at this time are, a new NBA franchise. They had been in the ABA, obviously, had a lot of success. But at this time, this is a different stage in the NBA where there are a lot of teams still struggling with financials, trying to, make a profit and survive. And, a tough time, especially, compared to now where the league is enjoying a very fruitful TV deal. It wasn't like that back in those times. So what was it like for, working with a small market team like the Pacers at the beginning? From what I read, you were doing everything from marketing to sales to eventually working in, player personnel decisions and helping out with that stuff. What's it like working with a small market team, especially at that time when, those teams are just sort of trying to get by?
Well, the good news for me was a small staff. I was at the bottom of the ladder. I literally was at the office 16 hours a day. I had nothing else to do. I knew nobody in Indianapolis when I moved down there. I couldn't afford a place, so I found a friend. I slept on his couch for about a year, so I didn't have to pay any rent. So I learned a lot. And one thing I did learn was the foundation of a franchise was selling season tickets, because I remember the owner would show up once a month and have a very aggressive staff meeting in which I got to sit in the corner of the room and listen. And he would pretty much make the point, we have to sell season tickets. So when my internship was up, I went to the general manager, and we had no sales staff. And I said, would it be okay if I could stay on and sell season tickets on a commission-only basis? And she got it approved by the owner. And that's really what got me in the door kind of for my first full-time opportunity. But as a young guy coming out of graduate school, for me, there was a lot of on-the-job, real-world work experience. I had to teach myself how to sell. Got involved in all aspects of the organization. If you were willing to do the work, there'd be a lot of people at the director's level that would give you a lot of their overflow work. And I can remember back then, the NBA, just to give you a perspective of an entity today that's going to probably do about $8 billion in revenue this year. Back then, the NBA did not even have a marketing department. David Stern did not even work for the NBA back then. He was a lawyer at Proskauer. So when I got in, I remember a year or so into it, somebody from the NBA came out and started interviewing all the teams because they were starting to form a marketing department. So much different NBA back then than there is now. But from my standpoint, working my way up the ladder, there was times where people in the office didn't get paid for 6 weeks because we didn't have the cash. I learned a lot about cash management, budgets, cash flow. Got the opportunity at age 24 to be the de facto general manager and negotiate player contracts and a lot of things that probably I wasn't qualified for, but I really got a hands-on opportunity, and it made me grow into the industry very quickly.
Do you remember the first contract that you negotiated, and how did you adjust to that new situation so quickly or immediately?
Well, the first big one I did was we drafted Clark Kellogg in the first round. I don't remember what number he was, but maybe around the 9th pick or so. So a good first-round pick. And he had an agent, a guy named Everett Len out of San Francisco. And the first conversation I had with Everett was he got aggressive with me to try me out, and he said, my title was assistant general manager. And he said, Bob, I don't know of another assistant general manager that's ever negotiated a first-round contract. And then I quickly retorted, well, there's a lot of general managers that have never negotiated a first-round contract, because back in those days, the first-round pick was typically done in a lot of cases by the owner. So I remember the negotiation, and I'd done a couple second-rounders the year before, but never a first-rounder. And I remember we ended up signing Clark. I believe it was for about $1 million over 5 years. So obviously, on average, that's about $200,000 a year. I think the market was about $2 million for 5 years, so he should have got about $400,000. And it went on for quite a while, and it got pretty aggressive and pretty heated. And I learned quickly that some of the agents have to put on a screaming match, or they don't feel like they've accomplished anything. But my world was real simple. We only had that much money. The owner made it clear, that's it. I don't care if I ever sign the guy. That's all we have. So eventually I got him signed, and there was a lot of people around the league that kind of took notice, like, wow, how'd you get him signed for such a great deal? You must be really good. And it was really more, that's all we had. But I kind of learned a little bit as I was sort of negotiations during those early years that if you're really prepared and you have some good arguments, and you can stay strong, and you're prepared to lose somebody or to not sign them, it's amazing the types of things you might be able to do. But that was a very intense, difficult, stressful time for me. But I also had times during that time period where we would mail out players' checks knowing that they would bounce, so we'd only have one signature on the check when you needed two, knowing that the player would have to come in and we could buy ourselves another day of cash flow while we tried to get the banks to fund our payroll. So You learn a lot in those days. The early Pacers days for me were still as one of the conditions to coming into the NBA. The Pacers did not get any of the national TV money for 3 years, and back then we shared $1 million a year in TV money. So our franchise was not receiving that money my first couple of years there. So there was just a lot of interesting things back then, and again, you learn a lot. There's no better. It's you don't learn as much when things are going great. Sometimes you think you're smarter than you are, but if you're able to do things when the elements are challenging and difficult, and you have a lot of problems to solve, I think that's when you have a chance to learn a lot. And I was fortunate enough to be in a lot of those opportunities at a very young age.
So after 4 years with the Pacers, you went on to become VP of marketing for the Kansas City Kings. What was that experience like, moving on, to a new situation, moving up in status for a team? Like, what was that like to go to Kansas City for that franchise?
Well, again, it was another brand new experience for me. I'd never been to Kansas City. Um, at that time, the person who was in charge of basketball for the NBA was a guy named Joe Axelson, and Joe had been the president and GM of Kansas City in prior years, and then he went to New York to become the vice president of basketball operations. So I had dealt with Joe a little bit on and off for about a year or two when I was pretty much running the Pacers on all basketball-related items. And then the Kansas City Kings got new ownership, and the one thing they wanted to do was to bring Joe back to run the show. And Joe was looking for an absolutely strong right-hand man to be his number 2 guy. And I didn't really know it, but I guess Joe kind of respected a lot of the things I was doing with the Pacers in some very difficult situations. And he got to know me a little bit from his days at the league office. So he invited me down to Kansas, and we had new owners with the Pacers who were having trouble really paying their bills, and we were strapped for cash. And he told me I'd get an opportunity to try to do some things where we actually could try to do things as opposed to try to just plug holes. So Joe gave me a pretty good sales pitch and convinced me to go join him in Kansas City, which I did, and I really enjoyed it. I got to do a lot of things. I started out pretty much running the whole business side of things. But I told Joe I wanted to get back into basketball. He said, well, give me a couple good years running the business, and then I'll let you come back into the basketball side of things. And so that's what I did, and we did the best we could in Kansas City, but unfortunately, after a couple years there, they sold to a group in Sacramento, and I don't want to get into all the politics unless you really want to hear the long story, but the short answer is we moved the franchise from Kansas City to Sacramento. And my last year in Kansas City and my 1 year in Sacramento, I was also very heavily involved in the personnel side of things.
So, like you said, they moved to Sacramento, and there's a lot of politics involved. So you end up getting to do what you want to do at the end. 1986, you become the president of basketball operations and general manager for the Supersonics. So how did that position come together for you? Especially for you that, like you said, you wanted to work more in the basketball operations side. So how did that situation come together for you?
So when we were moving from Kansas City to Sacramento, as you know, it's very difficult to move a team in the NBA, and it's something that they don't want to do, and it's something nobody should want to move a franchise. It's not good for a lot of reasons. But if that rare occasion comes where you do think you need to move, you have to go through a couple things. First, you have to show the league how hard you've worked in your current market and why it's not working there. And then probably more important, you have to show them why you think the market you're going to move to would be successful. Because the last thing they want is to take a franchise that's failing in one market and put it into another market and have it fail again. So we had to put together a lot of presentations and proposals to a committee of owners of the NBA to try to show them why we thought Sacramento would be a very good market. And 85, I think it was, Sacramento was not on the map. They had no professional sports. They did not have any major collegiate athletics. pretty much their professional sports was going down to the Bay, San Francisco, Oakland, and that's where all the teams were. So I kind of had to put together a lot of programs and pitches to show why we could sell season tickets and why we could get a certain amount of broadcast revenues and why we would succeed in Sacramento. One of the owners on that committee who had to listen to everything we had to say and recommend to the league whether or not we should be allowed to move was a guy named Barry Ackerley, who had just purchased the Sonics. And the first couple years he owned them, he was the president, ran the team himself, and they were losing a lot of money, and they had the lowest attendance in the NBA, and they hadn't made the playoffs in any of his years running it. And I think he finally got to the point where he realized this wasn't so easy. So we moved to Sacramento, and the only year I was there, we the top 5 in the league in revenue, and a lot of good things happened. Pretty much all the things we said we were going to do, we were lucky enough that they happened for us. And I think it was a combination of we worked very hard and it was a really good market. And the Sacramento community really responded to us. So I got to know Barry Ackerley a little bit through this time, and I think he thought, well, here's a young guy. Boy, he just did it in Sacramento. Maybe he could come out to Seattle and maybe jumpstart our franchise because
Hello?
He interviewed me to be president and hired me, and I took the job in '86.
Okay, that interesting. So, when you came into the Sonics, like you said, they were a struggling franchise. They sort of had struggled to recover from the championship years with Dennis Johnson, Gus Williams, Jack Sikma, and they had been 31-51 the previous 2 years. So, what you did first was you made 6 trades in a 6-month span after you took over. And one thing I do want to know, you drafted Nate McMillan. That was the first transaction you made as the general manager of the team. You drafted him in the second round, 30th pick. So, you make 6 trades in 6 months. What was your approach to the team when you first took over? Like, what in terms of, building the team and sort of trying to restart? I know Jack Sikma was probably one of the bigger trades you made at the beginning because he had such a strong connection with the franchise from being one of the holdovers from the championship team.
So what I did was, the one thing I knew was I was very confident because I'd been working in the league for a number of years with a couple of franchises, and I was confident in my abilities. Whether I had the right to be or not, I don't know, but I got a lot of experience at a young age, so by the time I was 30, I really was pretty seasoned. And I looked at the roster, and I told the owner, if I take the job, we're not going to be a slow walk-it-up-the-court team like they've been the previous couple years. And they always talk about how many games they almost, you're a slow-paced team. You can keep the scores closer, but they lost a lot of games. So I said, looking at the roster, by the time I had taken the job, Jack Sikma had already come in and requested to be traded to a contending team. He didn't want to finish his career with a bad team, and he quietly gave the Sonics a list of 5 teams he'd love to go to, but that, the team obviously could trade him wherever they wanted. So I told the owner there were 2 guys I wanted to keep, Xavier McDaniel and Tom Chambers. And what I liked about both of those guys is they could run the floor and they were athletic. I wanted to gut the franchise. I wanted to get athletes. I wanted to get up and down the court. I wanted a whole different style that would be more fun for the players, more fun for the fans, and we could get after it defensively and do some things and try to start winning games. So I used my youth to my advantage. All the guys in the league thought they'd take advantage of me because they didn't know who I was or what I was doing because I was brand new. So I knew they all would try to fleece me and get the best of me in trades. So I tried to let them fleece me, but really I had a pretty good idea what I wanted to do. And you're right, Jack was probably one of the foundation trades I had to make. They had traded away the first-round pick the previous year. So when I got there, even though we were a lottery team, we did not have our lottery pick because they had already traded that away, and that was the number 2 pick in the draft, which was already traded to the Celtics. they used it to take Lenny bias, and unfortunately that situation turned out very poorly, because Lenny's tragic death. But so I did not have a first round pick. So we were fortunate enough that with our second round pick, we got Nate McMillan, who turned out to be a tremendous player for us. Another foundation piece, fit the mold of what I was trying to do. An athletic player who could play multiple positions, could get up and down the court. And then after drafting Nate, it was probably in July, I think, I traded Jack to the Milwaukee Bucks for Alton Lister, who again is an athletic center, a defensive center who could block shots, rebound, and run the floor. And I got 2 first-round picks out of it. So now I got a mobile center, I got a swingman point guard in Nate, and I got my 2 thoroughbreds on the wings who could run. And that started to become the foundation of what I wanted to do. But I also knew, since the team hadn't made the playoffs for several years and nobody in the community cared about the team anymore, I had to get some winning going right now. So that's when I started to piece together some veterans like Maurice Lucas and Clement Johnson, and I needed to get some guys in the organization and in the locker room that had been used to winning and for being a lousy team. So it was a little bit of blend of getting the youth and developing the youth, and then getting some experience that could also help coach and develop the younger guys. And very fortunate that year turned out to be a lightning in a bottle. Not only did we make the playoffs, we pulled off a major upset, knocking out Dallas in the first round. And then even a bigger upset, knocking out Olajuwon in Houston in the second round. And then playing a competitive series, although we got swept, it was very competitive the first 3 games against Magic Johnson and the Lakers, who went on to win the whole thing. So the first year kind of went perfectly, and it solidified what I was trying to do, and gave me the credibility I needed in the community and with the owner and with people around the league that the Sonics were back on the right track.
And, another trade I forgot to mention was Dale Ellis at that time. He in Dallas, he wasn't playing too much, and you traded Al Wood to Dallas for Dale Ellis. And obviously that ended up being a big thing because, you played in the first round against Dallas, and he had a big series. So, how were you able to think about, training for Dale Ellis, who, he had a really good college career, but playing in the NBA for Dallas, he was sort of stuck on the bench because they had a really deep roster, in the backcourt with Blackman, and it was hard for him to get playing time. So how did you how were you able to acquire him, and since he might be considered?
For me, that was actually one of the deals that was sort of I had nothing to lose because I did not want Al Wood. I think he was the 4th pick in the draft, and frankly, it was just a bad draft pick, and he wasn't playing well for the Sonics. And we did like Dale, at least we did back when I was with the Kings in the draft. But the good thing is sometimes you like a guy in the draft and then you forget about him. Well, I never forget about guys. I keep following them. And Dale was in a situation really where Dallas had so many acquired over the years from Cleveland, and they seemed to be drafting the same position player, whether it was Blackman, Aguirre, Detlef Schrempf, then Dale Ellis. They had too many guys at the same spot, and they were all very good players, so Dale really never got the opportunity. So in my mind, I'm going to get a guy I liked. He's going to get a chance to play with us. If he's not so good, fine, we're out of the deal in a year or so. If he blossoms into something, we got something for nothing, and it worked for us. So Dale, who was really a small forward, we swung him to 2, and with Tom and X-Man and Dale, you kind of had 3 guys who could each play 2 positions, and you're right. I think that year we had all 3 of them averaging 20 points a game, and Dale was on fire in the playoffs. And Dale's one of those players where he plays with a chip on his shoulder, and my goodness, to get to play Dallas, the team that parked him on the bench in the first round of the playoffs, he lit up and he was ready to go. And he had a great playoff series for us and turned out to be an amazingly all-star, all-pro player. I mean, it turned out to be one of those lopsided deals that doesn't happen very often, but we just got fortunate that we got a guy who had never been given the opportunity, and we gave him the opportunity.
And I'm gonna move on, but like one thing I did want to ask you was, like you said that you were young coming into. Obviously, you were the youngest GM president in the league at that time, 30 years old. So was it? And you said like you had to prove yourself so that people didn't think that they could just pull one over you or take advantage of any situation. How was that experience like at the beginning, especially making all of those trades when you first came into Seattle? Like, did you have to? What did you feel like you had to prove yourself, or were there signs that that other your peers around the league were maybe trying to pull one over on you, or like how were those negotiations like at the beginning when you first started?
Well, I tell you, the real pressure wasn't around the league; it was internally. So I had a very good situation in Sacramento. I was the number 2 guy. I was going to become the number 1 guy when Joe retired. The owner was a year older than me, and we got along really well. So I was really set in Sacramento. But I went to Seattle because it gave me a chance. And I always knew that when you become the number 1 guy, you have to go to a really bad situation because that's why there's a job opening. You're not going to get to, usually you don't get to take the number 1 job with a really good situation. So when I took the job in Seattle, I agreed on a 3-year contract with the owner. And I kind of always take guys at their word. So when you shake your hand, you have a deal. And I don't mind if you haven't signed the contract. We can get that signed a little bit later. So I went up to Seattle, had a 3-year agreement, worked for a week or two because there was a lot of work to do. Then when I went into, we had left Sacramento. And then when I went into his office to sign the 3-year contract, he just looked at me and he crossed off the 3rd year. And I said, "What are you doing?" He goes, "We're going to make this a 2-year deal." And I go, "We agreed on 3 years and at these terms." And he said, "Well, I'll know if you're any good after 2. And so we negotiated, and I couldn't get my 3rd year. He to me and made me come up there on a 2-year deal. So that is pressure when you have a young family and your owner who gave you the big sales pitch on how badly he wants you. 2 weeks onto the job, he takes your 3rd year away. So I knew right there, forget the NBA, if I didn't perform quickly and well in Seattle, I wouldn't be around. And if I'm a young guy who didn't perform well, I probably wouldn't get another opportunity. So you'll never have more pressure than that. And thank goodness we had a tremendous first year. Then things started to blossom in year 2. And then the owner was dying to keep me. And then after 2 years, he gave me a new 5-year contract. And things worked out well. But I never forgot that. I had an owner who thrived on, frankly, trying to screw people. And I'd heard that before I'd taken the job. But, it was a job I really wanted. So you really need to understand who you're working with, who you're working for. And the pressure is always going to come from the owner, probably, whether it's hidden behind closed doors or public, you'll never know. But I think the message I would say to people, and what I've always learned is, do a good job, work very hard, stay true to what you're trying to do, and ultimately you do work at the whim of an owner, and he can do what he chooses to do because it's his franchise. But if your body of work is really solid and you've done good work, and it doesn't work out for whatever reason, your feet because you've done good work. So the pressure I learned after going from an owner who the handshake meant something. I went to an owner where the handshake didn't really mean anything, and that was a tough day when I came home to tell my wife I just got our 3rd year that we had counted on and we agreed to was just taken off the contract, and we were on a 2-year window, not a 3-year window.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like and like that's crazy that happened. Did you ever feel like that changed like your I mean, obviously it's only an initial relationship because you had talked with the owner initially when you when he first expressed interest in you joining the Supersonics. But does that change your relationship immediately from that standpoint? Like, if he crosses the
Well,
1 year off of that?
it confirms what a lot of people in the community had told me about him as a business person and as a man that he'll say one thing, but this is what his action. The actions speak louder than words with people. But at the end of the day, I've always said the owner owns the team, and my job working for an owner is to do the best job I can do. If I really disagree with him on something, especially if it's a moral issue or a legal issue or something of that nature, my recourse is to quit. But they own the business, and all you can do is try to steer it and make it better and help prevent them from doing some really bad things. But I do respect people. And I always respect the boss for being the boss, and I think that's important.
So after the first year where you make the conference finals, it's a big achievement in the franchise. You have a draft situation in the 1987 draft. I think you have two picks. So you draft Derrick McKey with one of the draft picks in 1987. And you also made a trade, which, in some respects, a lot of people sort of view it, Scottie Pippen, Olden Polynice trade. What was your thinking behind that? Because that's sort of a trade that sort of a lot of people look back on in terms of the Bulls being able to build.
Yeah, no, that was, the trade was we swapped picks,
yeah,
and we picked up some other things. Everybody in the league, including us, knew Pippen was going to be a very good player. But kind of like the Dale Ellis situation, he played the position where we had our three best players in Dale Ellis, Xavier McDaniel, and Tom Chambers. So that was we didn't need a fourth guy at that position. And frankly, with the coaches and me, I was now on a one-year deal, as were they, and the owner wouldn't give us any more extension. So we really were positioned to try to fill some needs. So Polynice wasn't great, but we needed to get a center. We needed a big man because our big men, Lucas and Clement Johnson, were older. And McKee was the guy that we really wanted, although he was also a front court player. He was a guy we thought could defend 3, 4, or 5 positions. So that's, had we had 5-year contracts, I might have taken about. Cleveland and Chicago were both making big offers to us to switch picks with us so they could get Pippen, and we did the deal with Chicago because they made us a little better offer. But had we had long-term contracts and we could have sat down and done a long-term plan, we might have kept Ellis or one of the other guys. But there's an example of the owner telling his management, you have 1 year, and after this year, I may or may not bring you guys back. So there's an example of why sometimes you don't want your guys on the shorter strings. But all in all, we still did fine because we improved. We made the playoffs again. And by the way, we made money every year I was there, and that was the number one thing the owner wanted, was to be cash flow positive. And he was negative cash flow the years he was running it. So although Scotty had obviously a Hall of Fame career, and I was lucky enough to trade career, it wasn't like we traded Scotty for Olden. We had prearranged on swapping picks, and we knew who they were taking, and we got some other considerations out of it. But no, all in all, those guys both went on to have long NBA careers, which I think is the most important thing when you pick. But neither of them had as good a career as Pippen, and frankly, I'm not sure Scotty's career would have been quite as good had he not been with Michael. But so Scotty got to the perfect situation and was the perfect player to play with Michael, and it worked out very, very well obviously for them.
So, like you said, you had a much improved regular season, 44-38. It's a 5-win improvement. You made it to the first round of the playoffs, lost the Nuggets in a really tight 3-2 series. So, going into 1988, the team is still really strong, but you lose Tom Chambers, I think, in the first real unrestricted free agency situation. For you, how was that situation, especially when the league sort of changed, I guess, a new CBA
Well,
keep going.
I think you can go back to when we talked earlier about negotiating, and it was an amazingly good thing for me to learn because literally overnight the league changed the rules, and we had no warning, no preparation. There were only two notable guys who would become unrestricted free agents overnight. One was Tom Chambers, who was in his prime playing for Seattle, and another one was Moses Malone, who was past his prime. He might have been playing for Washington or somebody back then. I don't remember. But the league gave up and allowed players to become unrestricted for the first time ever. But none of the really big market teams were in a position to lose a player. So I had a situation with Tom where I actually had an agreement to re-sign him, but his agent, Howard Slusher, pretty much told me, Bob, you can pay him whatever you want. We're not staying there. And as I learned, one of the reasons was the union needed to take the only marquee player out there who was eligible to be an unrestricted free agent named Tom Chambers and show the rest of the union, rest of the players, what it meant for a guy to be able to pick the team he wanted to go to. So Tom just picked Phoenix. So we lost Tom for nothing, which was very difficult because that was never a system that we ever had in place. But I always took that to learn how many guys could lose their best player for nothing and continue to move. So I always use that in my future negotiations, knowing that you have to be prepared to lose a player. It's no different than if he has a career-ending injury. But I had always planned my roster several years in advance, which I later would do, knowing what unrestricted free agency was. But it was a very difficult thing, and we kind of got dealt an immediate blow. But we survived. We endured, and that really was one of the reasons. Probably a year or so later, that I traded Xavier McDaniel because I was in a very difficult negotiation with David Falk. I knew what my budget was. My owner wasn't going to let me spend any more money, so I knew I could not get Xavier re-signed. I told David I was not going to lose X-Man for nothing, like I'd lost Tom Chambers for nothing. So either we get him signed or I'll trade him. And I think David thought I would never trade him because X-Man was our most popular player, and I think he thought I could squeeze more money out of the owner, which I couldn't. So when I got to the ceiling on that particular negotiation, I traded X-Man to Phoenix for Eddie Johnson and 2 first-round picks. And although I got beat up pretty good PR-wise on the short term, on the long term, that turned out to be a great deal for us. And again, that also allowed us to move forward. But I learned, I lost one guy because I did nothing wrong. They just changed the rules. But now that I knew what the rules were, I never wanted to lose a marquee player again for nothing. And so I think that's a little bit of how you have build for today, but also keep your future in mind.
And so, like you said, the team was still successful without Tom Chambers, 47-35, 1988-89. You made the second round of the playoffs after winning in the first round. You played the Lakers, who obviously were still a tough team. One game I did want to talk to you about from that series is Game 4. So the Sonics are down 3-0. You built a 43-14 lead, and the Sonics lost that game. I still think that's one of the more amazing. Wow. What were you thinking? Since you were running the team.
Was that in '87? What year are we talking?
Oh, that's '89. In the second round.
I remember the game. It was it was one of those. We had a young team. We had done all our speeches you could do. The not in our house. We're not going to get swept. We're not going to, And the Lakers had a great team, and they were up 3-0. So we thought. So we came out like gangbusters, and we looked like the greatest team on the planet Earth. But in reality, what we had done, we had used up so much adrenaline, so much energy in the building. We had run the marathon, only we sprinted the first 10 miles, so we had nothing left in us. We were out of emotional gas, physical gas. And the Lakers were smart enough and veteran enough to suddenly realize at one point in the game, they started chipping away. And and suddenly they got it back within range where they felt like, hey, we could go get him. Yeah, and they did the veteran thing, and they came back and beat us. And if you understand the NBA game, it's a long game, and there's a lot of ebbs and flows to it. But we had probably over-revved our guys up, and we just simply, frankly, we just ran out of gas. And once they caught the momentum, went their way, they pretty much knew how to win and close us out. And they did a great job of doing that. And that's why they were a world championship team, and we were still a young, growing, developing team.
Yeah, and so 89-90, you're 41-41. The team does barely misses out on the playoffs. And so the next year, you mentioned the Xavier McDaniel trade. So I think talking about it sort of in a vacuum, but you traded in December of 1990 Xavier McDaniel, like you said, for Eddie Johnson to Phoenix. And then in February of 1991, ahead of the trade deadline, you traded Dale Ellis to Milwaukee for Ricky Pierce, and you also traded Olden Polynice later to, I think, the Clippers. So, how, so you're sort of rebuilding and trying to figure out what this team is going to be like. You had already drafted Gary Payton, had drafted Shawn Kemp, and so you're sort of reshuffling the team into this new younger team of that group of players instead of Dale Ellis and Xavier McDaniel. How did you come to that conclusion to start getting rid of those veterans or mid
first I think you kind of brushed over probably the two most important draft picks of that probably maybe in the history of the franchise. Okay?
Yeah.
And that was in 89 and 90. So in 89, when I'd accumulated some of those multiple picks, I'd learned some things. I remember being 24 years old with the Pacers and being in some competition GM meetings with guys like Red Auerbach. And I wouldn't say much, but I learned a lot. And one thing I learned watching Red Auerbach was he missed on a lot of draft picks. He missed on a lot of trades. He struck out more than he got hits. But his hits were grand slams. He took Larry Bird as a junior eligible because he could afford to wait for a year. He, in effect, traded Joe Barry Carroll for Robert Parrish and McHale. He got a Danny Ainge who was playing baseball. So his deals were grand slams. So I in the '89 draft, I looked at it and I really was focused on. I didn't love the draft. It was really the draft, the year of the point guard, and we needed a point guard. So I had multiple picks. So I kind of made a deal with the coaches. I'll get you the point guard you want, and in our case, it ended up being Dana Barros. But there's this kid who's never played in college that I'm just infatuated with, and I really think if it all comes together, this guy, and this is literally what I wrote in my report, he can be a combination of Dominique Wilkins and Charles Barkley. The power of Barkley and the jumping ability of Dominique, and the guy's name is Shawn Kemp. Now, he's from the Midwest, from Indiana, went to Kentucky, never played, went to Trinity Valley, never played. So he sat out a year after high school, hadn't played. And as you can imagine, coaches, and that was back in the era where we hadn't had a high school player for a long, long time. Whether it was Moses or Daryl Dawkins, but there'd been a long drought, so nobody was doing this. And my owner said, absolutely not. I've never heard of this guy. You can't take him. But at some point, the coaches said, look, if you get us the point guard, we don't really care what you do with the other pick. That's between you and the owner. And they were okay with it. So the owner, kind of threatened to fire me, and we had a long talk. And he basically said, well, if you pick him, it's your tail. If this kid doesn't pan out, you're gone. But I still was confident enough, and I'd learned enough to know that if you really believe in it, you don't want to be fired later saying, geez, that's what I wanted to do, and I didn't have the courage to do it. So we took Shawn Kemp, and Shawn played, gosh, I bet you he played every game that rookie year. Maybe he missed one with a sprained ankle. But Shawn played literally probably 80, 81 games his rookie year, and you knew watching him play that there was these flashes that although he wanted everything to be a highlight, we knew after the rookie year we had something that was going to be special there, okay? But we also knew Dana could play. And then the following year, in the 90 draft, we'd won 41. We were 41 and 41, and we missed the playoffs like in a tiebreaker with Houston. So they went to the playoffs with the same record as us. Went to New York for the draft. I think we were tied record-wise with Atlanta because I remember winning a coin flip. So we got 2 ping pong balls, and they got 1. And then one of our little ping pong balls shot up to number 2. So we're coming out of the draft lottery in 90 with the number 2 pick in the draft, and the only player we want is Gary Payton. And here's a little thing that nobody will know or remember, but New Jersey has the number 1 pick. And they don't know if they're going to take Derek Coleman or Gary Payton, and they really are going back and forth. And we do not want Derek Coleman. You know, we have Shawn Kemp. We have our pieces in place. We want Gary Payton. So I end up making a trade with New Jersey. I trade them a second-round pick so that they will take Coleman and not Payton. And not only do I do that, I bluffed Orlando into giving me 2 second-round picks in that same draft because I told Orlando there's a good chance Coleman will be there at number 4, and PR-wise, they could not take Coleman. So I said, if you give me 2 seconds, I guarantee you Coleman will be gone when you select at number 4. So in that draft, I bluff Orlando into giving me 2 seconds. I give one of them to New Jersey, and I dictate the draft in the first 4 picks, and I make sure we get Payton with number 2. And now to fast forward to where you were on those trades in 90 and 91, we had the foundation laid. You know, we already had McKey, we got Kemp, we got Payton, we already got McMillan. I've got my young nucleus intact, and then I go pick up some more veterans in Eddie Johnson, and I get an all-star player, 6-minute year in Pierce. And by that time, we're having big problems with Ellis, really big problems. But I kind of wait long enough, and I pick my timing, and I get the Pierce trade done. So now we've got our foundation pieces, and then I think probably a year or so later, the final piece to our great team was I get the Lakers to trade me Sam Perkins for Benoit Benjamin, which really turned out to be another great trade for us in putting our final piece in that team together. But Kemp and Payton are the cornerstones of what becomes probably a 5, 6, 7-year run with a great team, and they're both guys taken out of the draft. Shawn Kemp was drafted outside the lottery, and Gary was the only lottery pick that our team ever got because we missed the playoffs for the only time ever, and we were lucky enough to get the number 2 pick out of it. So you got to really, before you zip ahead, you got to really focus on, we think we had our 2 foundation pieces, and Gary goes on to become a Hall of Famer, and Shawn goes on to become a multi-time All-Star for us, and they fit the style of play. And then obviously the final piece was I had to get a coach that could work with that kind of a talent base in the system. And I got George Karl, who had been blackballed by the NBA. Nobody was going to ever hire him again. And I had to fight my owner on that one because he would not charge. And he said I was going to be fired if George didn't pan out. But I, again, went with my gut. And George did a phenomenal job with that Sonic team. And, that's pretty much the pieces to the puzzle, and that team went on to win a lot of games and had a great run, and arguably could have won a championship, and ran into a Michael Jordan-led team and some other things. But, we built a really, really good team and a really exciting team, and I think it's one of the, other than probably the 79 team because they won the championship, it's the team that Sonic fans remember forever. It was a high-octane, exciting highlight reel with a lot of personality, and it was one that I think Seattle was very proud of.
Yeah, and I have to apologize. I absolutely buried the lead talking about the Xavier McDaniel and Dale Ellis trades because, I can't forget about Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp. But you picked me up, and here we go. So, like you said, the Sam Perkins trade. So moving, fast forwarding a little bit, the Sonics had shown that they were going to become a really good team with, like you said, Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp as cornerstones. Um, and so, the 41 and 41, 1991 show promise. You lose to the Blazers, who were, at the top of the league at that time, were one of the best teams. I think they lost in the conference finals to the Lakers, but I think they had won like 60 something games. So when you said like the George Karl hiring him in the middle of the 91-92 season, like you said, he had two stops, two stints with other teams. I think it was Golden State and Cleveland, and they hadn't worked out. And you said like he was blackballed. What did you see in him to want to hire him and have such a strong conviction that you were willing to like you said, fight your owner on it and hire him despite what other people around the league might have been saying about him?
Well, number one, our owner had hired the previous coach, Casey Jones, against my wishes, and I liked Casey, but his better days were behind him. But my owner was infatuated with Casey Jones, so when it was time to fire Casey, the owner agreed he had to fire him. And by the way, the owner didn't want to pay him his contract, which goes back to the type of guy he was. And I had to get the league involved just to get Casey the money that was owed him, because the owner didn't want to pay a guy to not work, even though that was the contract the owner had signed with him. So the owner did say, since he hired Casey, that this pick was going to be mine. And I didn't want to just hire somebody to hire somebody. I wanted to get somebody that could fit in with what I was trying to do. And I really believe George was a great basketball coach in terms of passion and up-tempo and all those things. George's problem always was and always will be George's ego. And it's massive, and it's usually massive before it has the right to be massive. And he's very difficult to work with and doesn't get along with players and all those kinds of things. So I saw a guy who couldn't get back in the NBA, so he coached in the CBA, which told me he still had a passion to coach. Then I saw a guy who went and coached in Spain, and he couldn't even speak, other than hola and adios. He didn't know any Spanish, so that was a very difficult thing to try to do. But that, again, told me he loved to coach. And I was able to negotiate a deal with George where I really had him under my thumb. I had the kind of control I wanted. And I also knew that I called probably 30 or 40 people in or around the NBA who knew George or had worked with George to get their thoughts on hiring him. Every single one of them said, "You are an idiot. Don't touch him with a 10-foot pole." And a lot of these guys were best friends with George, too. One of them told me, "Well, he's a really good coach. I can't tell you whether you should or shouldn't hire him, but there's a lot of high maintenance that goes with him." So George came with zero endorsements, okay? But I also felt that, George had success at a young age, and it blew his head up, and he just couldn't deal with it. I'd had a little bit of success at a young age, so I kind of knew how that might play out. But I felt that if I was the guy that brought George back, when he knew he could not get a job because he tried getting every job available and got nowhere, that George would actually try to, if I brought him back on a short contract, he probably would be loyal enough to me knowing that I was in his corner, because if George didn't work out, I was going to get fired. And he knew that. So George and I sort of became a team, if you will, because I put my job on the line to bring a guy back who had zero support. And I got the good George Karl. I got the guy who was hungry again. It would be like whatever Rocky sequel. I don't know if that was Rocky 2 or 3 or 4, but the one where he'd had the success and then he was too fat and didn't work hard. I got the one where he was willing to work hard again and try to rise again. And fortunate for me, it did work out, and George helped guide this team. It wasn't always easy. I mean, he and Gary had issues, and there was a lot of challenges, but they were the NBA kind of challenges that we were all willing to take on and work through and try to get to the promised land. And it did work out for George. It worked out for me for a while, at least, until that year we lost in the first round, and the owner wanted me to fire George, and I said, I don't think that's the right idea. And wanted to have us all cool down for a while. When we came back, I was the guy who got shown the exit, and George got an extension. But George did a terrific job during those years, and I think he revitalized his career, and he got 3 or 4 more jobs out of that. And as they say, the rest is history.
And so I know I have to let you go soon, but I'll try and speed through because there are 2 trades I definitely want to talk about. The Sam Perkins, so 92, 93, the team is like flourishing. So, I'm leaving out the part where George Karl, you hire him mid-season. You're 27-15 after he takes over. Make the second round of the playoffs. Everything it sort of bleeds into that next season where you guys are, one of the top teams in the West, like by far. I think 40-17 at one point. You win 50 plus games that year. So you guys are in the contender spot at that point, and so I guess obviously your goals and your objectives change. Instead of just building a team, now you really have like that team together. And you trade Benoit Benjamin and the draft rights to Doug Christie. He was a draft pick who he didn't sign with the team, a first rounder, and that was like at a time when a lot of first rounders weren't where there were difficult negotiations for a lot of teams. So you trade Doug Christie and Benoit Benjamin to the Lakers for Sam Perkins. What was the thought process with that? Did you feel like he was the missing piece to an already really good team that had shown that they were contenders initially?
Several things. Number one, the style of play we had. If you ever watched Benoit play, getting up and down the court certainly was not his forte. Benoit was never accused of outworking anybody. Benoit was clearly one of those guys that was very talented, but never had the inner drive to reach his potential. So style of play-wise, Benoit did not really fit with what we were doing. Personality-wise, back in the days, George Karl wanted to fight Joe Barry Carroll because he didn't work hard enough, and he ripped out Joe Barry's locker. Well, Joe Barry looked like the hardest working guy on the planet Earth compared to Benoit. So we had to put a lot of time and energy in with George to make sure George didn't want to fist fight with Benoit, because Benoit George was a stay true to the game, work hard. I mean, he don't cheat the game and all that. So I knew I had to get Benoit out of there, but I also had to get a player that fit our system. And Sam fit our system perfectly because he could play 5 and 4. Today they like to call these guys a stretch 4. Well, we had the stretch 4 in Sam Perkins. Nobody could extend the floor at that position better than Sam. I had a little extra sugar on the deal because George and Sam both went to North Carolina, and George had great pride in North Carolina, so I knew George would love Sam. Plus, Sam was a real professional and worked hard and was smart and cerebral and fit the system. So it was just a matter of me trying to convince Jerry West to trade me Perkins for Benoit, and that was not an easy sales pitch for me, but I was able to get it done. And once we got that trade done, I think we went to the conference finals that year and lost in Game 7 to Phoenix, and Sam became just a cornerstone final piece to that puzzle. But it's a combination of getting the types of players you knew. And you're right, we were going for the championship. At that point, it was we needed one more piece to be a championship caliber team, and moving Benoit out, who really had no playoff success or winning success at any point along his career, to a guy like Sam, who'd had a NCAA championship and had played on good teams and had that winning pedigree and been in the finals already, and fit with what we were doing, and it fit within our coach's philosophy. Everything that was the piece. It was just a matter of trying to figure out how to get the piece.
And so, I thought that part was always the really interesting part. Like you said, I mean, the 3 series that Seattle played in that playoffs, you beat Utah in Game 5, beat Houston in Game 7, and then the Phoenix series went to. All 3 are really, really good basketball series, just in general. If you've ever watched, or if anybody has ever gotten to see it. So the last trade that I did want to touch upon, because I feel like this trade is probably one of the more interesting deals in NBA history. Maybe I'm being biased because, I grew up being a Pacers fan, but the Derrick McKey Detlef Schrempf trade. So in October of 1993, the season's pretty much nearly underway. It's like a day or two before the season starts. You traded Derrick McKey and Gerald Patio to the Pacers for Detlef Schrempf. And I part of me like always feels like this trade is so interesting just because they're two really unique players. Like Derrick McKey obviously was a great defender, could guard multiple positions. He could score. Sort of a passive offensive player from a lot of the stuff I've read about him, and just from his career, a lot of people viewed he had like wondrous talent, and could be one of the best players, but was more into being a background player on offense and sort of taking over on defense as being a dominant force. Schrempf was sort of similar in a different way. He's a guy who could do just about everything like McKee, in the sense that he could shoot, he could pass, he could score, he could handle the ball. So how did that trade come together, and why make that trade after such a successful season?
Right. So I think you described the players pretty well. Derrick is a multi-talented, multi-position player, specializing at the defensive end, but very capable offensively. But one of those rare talents who's willing to sacrifice his offense for the betterment of the team. Detlef was a multi-talented, multi-positional player, primarily at the offensive end. Could handle the ball, could play several positions, could get your offense started from any spot. A little more challenged at the defensive end, but I think the key for me was this. My coach never really bought into Derrick because Derrick was a very smooth player, and the coach just never felt like he, literally didn't break a sweat, even though he could be working very hard for 48 minutes. And coach always felt he could do a little more, even though he did a lot. And I could see it was one of those personality things where sooner or later my coach was going to explode because, the personality of the player just didn't fit quite the coach's personality. And if there's a player he wanted me to trade, it was Derrick. Not because Derrick wasn't professional, just because he just didn't, that was the guy I could see things starting to bubble on. So Detlef, with his work ethic and all that, and just seemed to fit George's personality more. The problem I had was Indiana didn't want to trade him, and it probably took me 3 years to make the trade. And Donnie Walsh just couldn't pull the trigger. It was actually one of those trades that fit well for both sides. I don't think either side got the better of the deal. I think it was a good deal if you had either player. And finally, I think Indiana was forced with the position that Detlef had an opt-out in his contract, and they thought maybe at the end of the year they were going to lose him. And I think that's what forced the final willingness on Indiana's part to make the trade. So again, great trade for both sides. Don't think either side won in the deal. Neither side lost. It was just two good players, two very good players changing scenery. And I loved Derrick. I would have been happy keeping Derrick. I loved Detlef. Was happy having Detlef. So it was one of those rare. In effect, you traded the defensive model for the offensive model, and any team in the league would be happy with either one of those players.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think both players really fit in with where they went. Derrick McKey really helped transform Indiana from just an average defensive team to like what Coach Larry Brown wanted, a great defense, and Schrempf on the offensive side really transformed the Sonics. So, like that team, the Supersonics are dominant 93-94. Instant favorites again. And so the first round of the playoffs, we know how the story goes. They win the first two games like you would expect at home, relatively easily. They lose the next two games in Denver, and then Game 5, everyone, it's a really tight game, and in overtime the Nuggets end up winning. Obviously, everyone remembers Dikembe Mutombo holding the ball at the end. So for you, at that experience of, finally feeling like this team is going to get to the top, you had just made the conference finals, got in this close to the NBA final, and then finished it off with another 60-win season. Uh, what was it the mood around the organization after, being upset in such a dramatic way that had never happened at that point?
Well, obviously it stings. There's no question about that. But if you look back at that team, we've been kind of textbook. We win 41 games, we go to the first round. We win 47 games, we go to the second round. We win 55 games, we go to the third round. We win 63 games, and everybody thought we were going to win the championship, but we lose in the first round. It was the first and only time in 4 years where we didn't have the classic just keep getting better. The owner during that year was already ordering championship rings. He thought we had the championship in the bag. I think that was Michael's first year retiring. I can't remember.
It was, yeah.
But it was a setback, no question about it. We also had our core guys were still young, Payton and Kemp. It was the first time they experienced any setback. And by the way, in hindsight, that was a hell of a team Denver had. Even though it was the 8th seed, it was a really good basketball team. And I think that series helped drive the change to making the first round 7 games, not 5 games, just because it's a little harder to upset somebody in 7 games than it is in 5. But the owner who didn't like George Karl from day one because he wanted different guys to be the coach, and I hired him against his wishes. Immediately, I mean, literally the day after the series was over, called me in his office. He wanted me to fire George Karl. And I explained why we're going to win it next year, and I'm going to use this first setback and only setback we've had in 4 years to launch us to the championship next year. And I really knew how we could do it. And I think all championship teams along the way, you're going to have some setback, and we hadn't had one. But the owner and I got into it. He wanted him fired immediately. And I talked the owner into, let's get away for a week. Let me go take a week vacation. I'll come back. We'll talk it through. Ultimately, if that's what you want, I'll do it. But we can always do it a week from now. You don't have to do it today. Well, he was so mad that I wouldn't do it that day. As soon as I left for vacation, he announced to the community that I had resigned, which I had not. So then we got into it, and he wanted to fire me, but he didn't want to pay me. And so he kind of iced me for a month or so until after the draft. And I ended up leaving, but as I ended up leaving, he had to give George Karl an extension because he couldn't get rid of both of us. And the other thing that upset the owner that year was I was selected Executive of the Year, and he felt he should have been the Executive of the Year. And I tried to explain to him that it's usually the general manager, not the owner, and that I don't pick it, that the other general managers vote on it. And he just wanted he wanted that award. And I tried to explain that it's not an owner award, it's a GM award. But so anyway, we had some weird stuff going on there. But so the irony is, George got a long-term extension. I kind of got shown the door because I didn't fire George quick enough. And then I went on and took another job. There was no shortage of people wanting to hire me. And then eventually George got to stay and continued the run. But he and the owner and the new management never quite saw, I think, eye to eye. But again, it was a tough thing. But I really think that team, had I stayed, I really believe we would have won championship. And we could have kept the chemistry, and most of those relationships were mine because I brought all those guys in and spent a lot of time with them. And but that's just the way it goes, and those are how these stories go. There's always some drama. There's always some, you won't believe it if I told you, to the story. And great team, probably one of the best teams ever to not win a championship, and feel bad because I really think we had a championship team there.
And like, just to touch upon it, you kept the same or not you, but like the team after that made the finals, and 150, high 50s, the low 60s up until 1998. I mean, that team was practically still your team in terms of like pretty much everybody from
Yeah, no,
from that division team.
It was the same core group that had got to be together for I don't know how many years they ended up being together, but 5, 6, 7, 8, which was they had a great run. Which is what you want. You want to build it, give them a great run, and hope they get lucky and win one or more. We didn't get the luck to win it. Part of it was a little owner disruption at the front end. A little bit of it was a guy named Michael Jordan at the back end. But it was a very, very good team.
And just to like finish on, I guess I'll ask only probably a few questions. What I always found interesting about those Sonics teams is they were such a forward-thinking team, or at least you and like George Karl in terms of how you guys ran that team. I think you see a lot of what the NBA is now or you see what the Sonics did at that time in a lot of the NBA now in terms of, having a big that could stretch out. And also, like Sam Perkins, even though he was a good shooter, he didn't really shoot many threes when he was on the Lakers or in Dallas. But as soon as he went to Seattle, he was, I guess, was allowed a lot more time to shoot threes and, a lot more opportunities. But, also from the trapping, having a lot of trapping on defense in terms of like the players on the court, enforcing steals and being able to get out on the fast break. That was such a unique sort of defensive system, a very aggressive style compared to a lot of teams that were a lot more conservative and relying on big men. And I think also the ability for so many different players on your team to post up. Perkins could post up and shoot threes. Shawn Kemp posted up. Gary Payton posted up. And Kendall Gill, Detlef Schrempf. So you pretty much had a roster where, it could be inverted, where the center and power forward could be out on the perimeter, and you can throw the ball into Gary Payton or Detlef Schrempf and have them post up. So I always thought that part was unique. One thing I do want to ask you, like, in terms of philosophy, a lot of people always wondered, if the Sonics had a superstar center like Patrick Ewing or Akeem Olajuwon, maybe that's what they were always missing. And at that time, there was so much focus on having a great center. Now, in today's NBA, over the past probably, 8 to 10 years, that's not as much of an important focus of having an offensively dominant center. Did you ever feel like, oh, I have to go out and get a center throughout your, 8 years running the Sonics? Or were you, perfectly fine and not concerned about this idea that you have to have a great center to win a championship? Did you struggle dealing with that over that time?
I think back in those years, there were a lot of great big men. There aren't a lot of great big men anymore. That trend may come back. Hopefully, you never know. But absolutely, if I could have got one of those guys, I would have. I came close to getting Olajuwon multiple times, but at the end of the day, they never traded him. Most of the big men, you had to have the number 1 pick in the draft. Sonics franchise, even today in Oklahoma, they've never had the number 1 pick in over 40 years. So if you're going to build your franchise saying, I'll get the number 1 pick, and I'll get Olajuwon, I'll get Ewing, I'll get David Robinson, I'll get Tim Duncan, fill in the blank, you got to have the number 1 pick to get that guy. And there's a franchise that going on 50 years has never even had that pick. So that's pretty hard to get. Number 2, they're very rare to get them in free agency, unless Shaquille O'Neal, who was the number 1 pick, calls you up and says, I'm coming to LA to make movies, clear some cap space. Well, if you're in a market that's not Hollywood and not set up to make movies, he's not coming your way. So I think we all would have loved to have that guy, and we all were in constant search of that guy, but we tried to do it within the framework of something where we actually had a chance to accomplish it. And that's where we had depth, versatility, the type of team you just described a few minutes earlier. That was all done by design. We could extend the whole floor defensively. The NBA about mismatches, and the roster we had put together, we knew every night we could have somebody on our roster that would have a mismatch. If it was putting Payton down on the block and posting him up on littler guards, we go there. If it was putting Perkins on the block, fine. If it was stretching Sam out to three-point range and bringing the big man out, fine. But we built a team that we knew every night we could create advantages, which I think is very important. But don't get me wrong. If we could have had a Hall of Fame center, we would have done that in a heartbeat. We would have adjusted and built some things around it. But it's very difficult. You know, we never had the number one pick. In my whole career, we had one lottery pick, and that team won 41 games and lost 41. And we were lucky enough that little ball went up and got the number 2 pick. And that was a terrible draft year, but we found a way to make it. We took the only guy who turned out to be a Hall of Famer, and we got him. And he happened to play a backcourt position. So, you know, getting the big man, getting the superstar big man is hard to do. And some of those superstar big men like Ewing, you know, they still never won it. So you got to get them, and then you got to build around them properly. So it's kind of a twofold thing. And even the Michael Jordan teams, they never had the Hall of Fame big man. They had big guys, Cartwright and different big players, but these were not Hall of Fame centers. But their Hall of Famer was, you know, Superman wearing number 23. So there's a lot of ways to get it done. But I would start and stop with every team. If I could get a franchise big man, I would always start with that. But there aren't very many of them around today, if any. But if and when you can get one of those guys, I would gobble them up, and I would certainly figure it out and build from there.
I was thinking about Shaq and thinking maybe he would have gone to the Vancouver Grizzlies. People shoot movies in Vancouver sometimes. But okay, so I did want to touch upon 2 quotes, and this is probably going to be the end of it. So Jerry West said in a 1996 Seattle Times article, "You can make a deal with Bob. He likes to negotiate more than I do. If there's something I want to do, I'll spend the extra $10 to make it happen. Bob likes to dicker, but you know you're not wasting your time with him. It is not a game for sissies. We all lie in this business," says one of his NBA peers. "I like to know the answers before I ask the questions, so I know who is lying about what." So, you know, I thought that was one of the more interesting quotes that I found about you, like Jerry West saying that, you know, you're willing to negotiate and try and get the best out of the deal. So what was it like negotiating deals throughout that run with Seattle? You know, working around the league.
I was one of the rare guys. I was also the president, okay?
Yeah.
So I was in charge of the whole business operation, manage budgets, cash flow. Most of the guys were just the general manager. They were not in charge of money, the business. To them, it was salary cap money. It was kind of like monopoly money. And if you're a big market with all the money, you didn't. I think what Jerry was trying to. I knew how long it took our marketing guys to sell a $100,000 sponsorship. So if I was able to grind out $100,000 in the deal, I would do it because it was important to our franchise. The Lakers had so much money that they just wanted to get the player, because if they got the player, money would just flow in. So I think Jerry kind of, you know, just that he didn't have to get involved with. But he knew I was the sheriff and the mayor, and I wanted to take care of both sides. Plus, I had budgets. My owner, I had to make sure I had a profit every year, and that was the number one priority. So I think when you negotiate deals and trades, you got to kind of know who you're dealing with, what's important to them, who makes the decision, timing of deals, who's got thick skin, who has thin skin, who has to take the media temperature for 2 months before they even can think about making a deal, who has the courage to make a deal. Because generally speaking, making trades, guys don't like to make them because there's media scrutiny, there's fan scrutiny, there's owner scrutiny, there's locker room. And if the trade doesn't turn out, you're probably in trouble. It's a lot easier to say, geez, the cap doesn't allow me to do it, but I tried. Okay, and I think what Jerry's saying is Jerry was a deal maker. He you know, you got to be confident. You got to know what you're willing to do and what you want to do, and then you got to do it. And we all know if you make enough deals, they're not all going to pan out. But the body of your work is the whole, not just one deal here or one deal there. So you're constantly shaping it until you get it the way you want it. And if you get it the way you want it, and you've done it right, you should have a really good team.
And, you know, one of the other quotes that I saw in the Seattle Times in 1994, It was about you and George Karl, like your relationship. It said, on many evenings, Bob Whitsitt and George Karl will order a couple of buckets of popcorn and retire to an office back in the catacombs of the Coliseum. There, they'd fire up the satellite dish and, while watching a game in some distant time zone, chew the corn and the fat. In front of a wall on which the rosters of every NBA team were written, they'd plan and they'd argue, they'd discuss and they'd dream. So, was that like a perfect illustration of your relationship with George Karl? You guys were always sort of looking at the team, looking around the league to see what was going on, and always thinking about how you could get better as a franchise.
Well, I think yes. First of all, if you're going to be in this job, you have to have a passion. Today, I do a lot of consulting. I do a lot of stuff, but I watch as much as I've ever watched, probably more, because I have more time actually to even do it. And I'm amazed at how many general managers or scouts or people I talk to around the league don't even know how their team did tonight, don't even know if they're playing, don't watch their games. They go scout the college game and they leave with a quarter to go in, 10 minutes to go in the game. And they're getting paid to do this, but they're skipping corners, they're cutting corners, they're not really doing the job. And those franchises owners don't even know what's going on because it's too far drilled down. I want people in our organization that it's not a job, it's a passion. And now when you're talking about a game at midnight or rehashing 5 games and arguing over philosophy and what you can do, that's how you're going to develop and create something, because it's something you love to do. George loves the game. He loved the game. And probably if there's a critique of myself, I probably needed to get a little bit away from it occasionally back then, because it was too much 24/7. I think there's times you got to take a deep breath so you can see it differently, but I'd rather err on the side of being too much into it and loving it too much. But no, and I think George also knew that, for example, the McKey-Schrempf trade, that was driven as much by me trying to help my coach get the roster. He was 100% behind, and he knew I was willing to trade somebody I drafted, I loved, and I thought was a great player, to help him just a little bit more. So sometimes when the coach knows you're really, heck, at the end of the day, he knew he was going to get fired, and I went and took a bullet for him. I don't know too many guys who today would take a bullet for their coach, where they lose their job and the coach stays. It usually goes the other way, where, hey, if the owner wants, sends the coach under the bus, and they keep their job. So I think George and I had a very special relationship. It was good. It was fun. It was exciting. And I do know this. We both put everything into it we had, and we both wished that we could have given Seattle a championship, but doggone it, we did come close. And from where we started with a non-playoff team that had the lowest attendance in the league and nobody cared about it, we certainly put the air back in the balloon, and that's something I think we're both very proud of.
And so last, I'll do a quick lightning round. It'll just be quick questions to ask you about that time.
Yeah,
so
you gotta go quick, because I got some guys in the room that have been waiting for a while, but I gotta go have a meeting. So
okay,
give me a quick thing, and then unfortunately I gotta sign off.
All right. So this is lightning round. Player you were most sad to trade.
Oh boy. Sad is a tough word. It wasn't easy for me to trade X-Man.
Yeah.
For me to trade Derrick McKey.
Okay. Trade you most regret.
Trade I most regret. Gosh, I don't really regret trades. They don't all work out, but I don't like to look back and say, hindsight's easy. I'm more interested. The only regret I would ever have is if I didn't do a trade that I thought I should do, because I didn't have the courage to pull the trigger. I think I always had the courage to pull the trigger if I felt it was the right thing. So I really don't have any regrets from that standpoint.
And final question, do you like the nickname Trader Bob?
Well, Well, that's not one I would go out and give myself, but I don't think it's a bad name. I think it sort of says, I've always felt my job is to try to give the fans the best team possible, and I've never wanted to be one of those guys who spins it in the media or hides behind why I can't do things, and I just sit there and I get a big fat check to have a mediocre to bad team. I've always felt the fans pay a lot for their tickets. They're passionate, and they should have somebody running their franchise who's aggressive and trying to deliver a good team for them. So if Trader Bob means he's aggressive when he needs to be to try to give our fans a really good team, then I'll take it. I'm proud of it, and I'll move on.
Do you know where Trader Bob came from? Just a quick, just wondering, because.
Yeah, it came during that one year where I made a lot of trades. They were all pretty good trades. I think it was the year we got Perkins, and we might have just done, I don't know, maybe we did Kendall Gill. I can't remember. But one of the sports writers nicknamed me Trader Bob, and that sort of caught on. I don't remember which year it was, but it was one of those years where we fired off a handful in 1 year.
Okay. All right. I know you have to go, so I really appreciate you taking the time to speak about this. You definitely gave me a lot.
I appreciate your persistence. I know I didn't get there quickly, but thanks for keep pushing until we got her done.
Oh, no worries. I really appreciate you taking the time. You really gave a lot of great conversation.
Okay, Raphael. We'll talk another time.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. Thank you for listening to the NBA Trades podcast, and also thanks to Bob for being on. It was very gracious of him to spend an hour and a half talking about a lot of different trades. So you can follow NBA Trades on Twitter, NBA_trades. If you want to see any trades that I've done on the site recently, go to nbatrades.tumblr.com. Or if you want to listen to a podcast, you can also go on the same website. If you want to listen to the podcast on iTunes, we're available on iTunes as NBA Trades Podcast. Subscribe, write a review. Reviews always helpful, so I appreciate that. And also, we're available on Stitcher. You can do the same thing. Subscribe, write a review. Would really appreciate it. And thank you for listening.